Let me just, sorry, trying to fix my Zoom screen. There we go. Okay. So like she said, I'm going to be going over some information about food labels. And like I said, also, my name is Tracy Saupan. I'm a student with UAB. I'm going to be graduating in December with a master's degree in nutrition, and I'm studying to become a registered dietitian. So just really quickly, these are our objectives for today. My goal is to help you guys understand what each section of the food label means, understand how to use each section to choose healthy food options when you're shopping, and also learn how to interpret different health claims that you might see on different food labels or different food packages, I mean. Okay. So just to start out, why should we understand food labels? Why is that important? So first of all, obviously to help us make healthier food choices. So I know sometimes it can be really challenging to do that. Like Emily mentioned, there's a lot of conflicting information and sometimes it's kind of hard to understand. It's also really helpful when it comes to managing chronic health conditions, because a lot of conditions might require you to limit certain nutrients. For example, if you have a heart condition, your doctor might recommend that you limit your sodium to a certain amount, right? So it's really helpful, with certain chronic conditions as well. And then also, I don't know if people are kind of aware of this, but different brands of food might include different additives to kind of change the flavor. So sometimes they'll add things like sodium, fat, sugar, things like that, so that consumers will like their product better and they'll get more people buying their product. But you don't realize that, when you're adding, sugar, sodium, things like that, when you're cooking, that it's already been added to the food that you bought. So it's good to see exactly what you're getting, right? And then just as kind of a side note, and I'll mention this throughout the presentation too, nutrients that most people should get less of, meaning most people probably have too much of these, are saturated fats, sodium, and added sugars. And then nutrients that most people should get more of, or in other words, most people don't get enough of, would be dietary fiber, vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium. Okay, so this is everything that food labels include. And I know kind of at a first glance, it seems a little complicated and a lot of information. It seems like a lot of information, but that's why we're going to break it down today, just so it's a little more simplified. I did want to make a note too. We are going to go over the amounts of each of these nutrients that your body needs to stay healthy. But I wanted to point out, sometimes people get kind of bogged down in the specifics of the numbers. But it's really important that when it comes to, food labels or the amounts that your body needs, you don't need to, because some people get very specific with, I have to meet this number, I have to limit to this number, right? They really should be used as a guideline for yourself, because these recommendations are based on healthy individuals and of a certain age and everything. So it's just important to not get too stressed about getting so specific about them. They really should just be used as a guideline. I mean, like I mentioned before, if you have a specific health condition where your doctor told you to limit a certain nutrient, obviously that's different. But for most people, it should just be used as kind of a general guideline for yourself. Okay, so we're going to start off with the serving information. So obviously it shows the number of servings that are in each container. And then the serving size, as I'm sure you guys are probably familiar, is the amount of food of the food item that the nutrient information is based on. So for example, if you're looking at how much fat is in the food item that you're looking at on this food label here, if you're only going to use 1 cup, then there's only 9 grams of fat in this item, right? But if you're going to use the whole container, there's going to be 36 grams because there's 4 servings and there's 9 grams per serving. Okay. And then next up, we have the calories. So the daily need for most healthy adults is 2,000 calories per day. Like I mentioned before, this is based on, your health goals, your age, size, gender, but in general, the recommendation is 2,000. And then some foods that are a little bit higher in calories, I'm sure you guys are probably familiar. Fried, processed foods, desserts, things like that. So those are just kind of some things to watch out for. Okay, and then next we have the percent daily value. So the percent daily value is basically the percentage of the daily nutrient need that's included in one serving of the food item that you're looking at. So as you can see here on our example, if you're looking at sodium, for example, right, this one has 37%. So what that means is that's a little over a third of the amount of sodium that you should have in a day. So again, this should be used as more of a guideline, right? So okay, this food is a little bit higher in sodium, so it might be helpful if I have this now, it might be helpful for maybe other meals that I'm going to eat today, maybe have a little bit less sodium. Um, and then just as kind of a guideline, 5% or less is generally considered lower. So if you're looking at sodium, again, if you're looking at something that has 5% or less, then that's lower in sodium. Or if you have 20% or more, that would be considered high. So obviously our 37% here would be considered a higher amount of sodium. And then this table I thought would be just kind of a helpful visual, I guess. So this just shows the actual daily value of each, and we're going to go over these with each nutrient as well. But so for example, the saturated fat, you need about 20 grams per day. So you want to keep it at 20 grams or less. So that 20 grams would be the 100% that you're looking at, right? So let's say you're looking at a food item that says it has 50% of your daily value, then that means it's going to have 10 grams. So I know for some people, the numbers are a little bit easier than the percentages. So I just wanted to kind of show this to see how everything kind of lines up. Okay. And then next we have the total fat. So for the total fat, we do want to try and limit the total fat to about 20 to 25 grams per meal. For this one, I wanted to give kind of a meal recommendation just because sometimes it's a little easier that way. And then also for saturated fats, which is included in the total fat, as you can see on here, we do want to limit saturated fat intake to about 20 grams per day, just because too much can increase the risk of heart disease and stroke. So it's definitely something to be mindful of, right, when you're trying to choose healthier options. And then foods that are higher in fat tend to be things like butter, fatty cuts of meat, processed meats, things like that. And then I know I mentioned this before, but total fat was one of the foods that, or was one of the nutrients I mentioned that most people do need less of. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind. Okay. And then next, we have cholesterol. So as many of you probably know, cholesterol is only found in animal products. And then the recommendation for cholesterol is kind of based on your risk for heart disease. So if you don't necessarily have risk factors for heart disease, you should try to limit to about 300 milligrams per day. If you do have risk factors, it's something, or risk factors for heart disease, it's something, you might want to be a little more mindful of. So you may want to limit that to 200 milligrams per day. And like I said, you can always use the percent daily value as well if you don't have the risk factors for that. Sometimes I know for me, it's a little bit easier that way. And then foods that are higher in cholesterol are also associated with an increased risk of heart disease. And then some examples of food that are higher in cholesterol are red meat, processed meats, whole milk, things like that. Like I said, animal products, right? And then obviously, since they're only in animal products, fruits, vegetables, other plant foods, things like that, don't have cholesterol. So if you're concerned about your cholesterol intake, it's good to, increase maybe your fruit and vegetable intake, things like that to kind of help limit that for yourself. Okay. And next up, we have sodium. So the recommended amount for sodium is about 1,500 to 2,300 milligrams per day. So for sodium, the minimum amount that your body needs is 1,500. Like I said earlier, sodium is one of the foods that most people have too much of. Most Americans eat about 3,400 milligrams per day. So the minimum would be 1,500, but you really want to try and stay below 2,300. And again, this is another one where I feel like the daily or the percent daily value is a little bit easier to follow on this one, just so you don't have to keep track of the specific numbers. And then just some examples of foods that are high in sodium are frozen or prepackaged meal, like the TV dinners and stuff like that. Deli meats, soups, a lot of canned foods can be really high in sodium. So those are just kind of some things to watch out for. Okay, and then next up, we have the total carbohydrates. So as you can see, this kind of has a little bit more of a breakdown of other things. So this includes fiber, sugars, and added sugar. So the daily need for carbohydrates would be 275 grams. Again, this is based on, 2,000 calories a day. The fiber need specifically would be about 20 to 30 grams per day. And then we want to try and limit any added sugars to 25 grams a day. And then some foods that are higher in carbohydrates would be things like French fries, soda, potato chips, things like that. And then also I wanted to kind of point out, I know I mentioned these before, but fiber is one of the foods that I mentioned previously that most people need to get more of. So that would be in things like fruits, vegetables, whole grain foods, things like that, or whole grain breads. And then added sugar is one of the ones that I mentioned that most people need less of. So again, just something to be mindful of. Okay. And then next up, we have protein. So protein is a little bit different than the other ones. That's why this is why there's not a percentage daily value for protein, because it really depends on your weight, actually. So the daily need is 0.65 to 0.90 grams per kilogram. So if you're trying to calculate how much you should have, you want to take your weight in pounds and divide it by 2.2. So that's how you would get your kilograms. And then you can take a look and see, okay, what is that? So you would take your weight times 0.65 or 0.90, right? So you can kind of see your range. So for example, for a person who weighs 200 pounds, that would be 91 kilograms. So the amount of protein they would need would be 59 to 82. And if you're 171 pounds, that would be 78 kilograms, which would be 51 to 70 grams per day. And you can always, I know a lot of people, I know I do this. You can use the Google where it converts different different units for you. So that sometimes is a little bit easier if you put in there how much you weigh in pounds, it'll tell you your kilograms, and then you can multiply that by 0.65 and 0.90 to see what your range would be. And then some examples of high protein foods would be things like dairy products, lean meats, fish, things like that. And then let's see here. I just want to make sure I covered everything here. Okay. Okay, and then next up, we have vitamin D. So with vitamin D, the recommended amount is 20 micrograms per day. So for vitamin D, this is one of the ones that I mentioned before that most people don't get enough of, right? So some foods that are naturally high in vitamin D are things like fatty fish, fish liver oils. Obviously, we can get vitamin D from the sun, right? But a lot of people, most people are not really in the sun enough to get enough vitamin D. And with so few foods being naturally high in vitamin D, it can be hard for people to get enough. So that's why a lot of foods are fortified with vitamin D. So some common foods that are fortified with vitamin D would be things like milk, orange juice, canned tuna, things like that. Yeah, and like I said, this is one of the foods that most people don't get enough of too. So this is one to kind of keep an eye on too for yourself. Okay. And then calcium is our next nutrient. So the recommended amount for calcium would be 1,300 milligrams per day. So some good sources of calcium would be dairy. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with that one. There's also almonds and leafy greens are also good sources of calcium. I feel like those ones people are not as familiar with. So some examples of the leafy greens that I mentioned here would be things like collard greens, kale, spinach, things like that. And then obviously with the dairy would be, milk, yogurt, cheese, things like that. And then again, calcium is one of the other foods I mentioned that most people don't get enough of. So another one to kind of, be mindful of. Okay, and then next up we have iron. So the recommended amount for iron is 1,800 milligrams per day. So again, this is another one that most people don't get enough of. So some good sources of iron would be things like beef, poultry, light tuna, really a lot of lean meats would be a good option for iron, red meats would be a good option for iron because they have more iron in them, but sometimes lean meat might be better because then there's less fat and cholesterol and things like that. So it's good to kind of use all of these together as sort of a balance. But again, that's why I prefer to use the daily percent value because it's a little easier to kind of see everything at once. Okay, and then next up we have potassium. So the recommended amount for potassium is 4,700 milligrams per day. So again, this is another nutrient that most people don't get enough of. Good sources of potassium. I know most people are probably familiar with bananas. There's also beans, spinach, potatoes. So those are some good things to kind of watch out for if you're needing more potassium. Okay, so that's everything for the food labels. I also wanted to kind of briefly go over health claims because I know before I started studying nutrition, I felt like I was kind of all over the place with the health claims and I didn't really understand. So a health claim is basically a brief description of a food product's nutritional value, right? So it doesn't give specific amounts like the food label does, but it's just kind of a brief description basically. So I'm sure you've seen them, fat-free, sugar-free, 100% whole grain, things like that. They actually do make it easier to compare different food options, and they have to meet specific requirements. The food item has to meet specific requirements in order to have health claims on the packaging, which I felt like was really good to know because I was always kind of unsure before I learned about this. So that I feel like that was kind of helpful when I learned about this myself. So we're just going to kind of go over some examples of different health claims. So the ones I've listed here are considered nutrient content health claims. So if a package says that it's high in something, that means it has 20% or more of the daily value. And if you remember from our daily value slide, 20% or more would be considered high in something, right? Or if it says that it's rich in something or an excellent source of something, that would mean that it has 20% or more of the daily value. If it says good, so meaning like it's a good source of something, it would be 10 to 19% of the daily value. If it says it has more, then that means it has at least 10% more of the daily value than just sort of the general product line. So you'd have your general product line, and then this one would say more of, more potassium or whatever you're looking at, right? So that means it has at least 10% more of the daily value for that nutrient. And then if it says it's light, it has at least a third fewer calories or 50% less fat. And then if it says less or fewer, it has at least 25% less of a nutrient or the calories, depending on what you're looking at. And then next up, we have the calorie health claims. So if it says calorie free, it means there's less than 5 calories in that food item. If it says low calorie, it means there's 40 calories or less. And then reduced calories would have to have at least 25% fewer calories. And then I know we've talked about sodium a lot. Sodium health claims are also very common. So if it says sodium free or salt free, that means it would have less than 5 milligrams of sodium. Very low sodium would be 35 milligrams of sodium or less. Low sodium would be 140 milligrams of sodium or less. And then reduced has to be at least 25% less. Sometimes it will say on the package that it, for example, one that we're going to look at in a second says 35%, reduced sodium, 35% less. So sometimes it will be less, but it has to be at least 25% less. And then if it says light in sodium, then it has at least 50% less sodium. Okay. So I wanted to kind of briefly go over an example. I know sometimes this is a lot of information all at once. So I thought it might be helpful to kind of show how you can use the information that we looked at. So I'm only going to look at a couple of ingredients in this recipe, just so you can kind of get an idea. But this is just a chicken noodle soup recipe that I found online, because a lot of times soups, like I mentioned before, soups can be really high in sodium. So it's something to be aware of. For me, what I do when I'm, making a meal at home, if I know that, I'm using a lot of canned foods, I try to look at, reduced sodium options, even if you're using it with a recipe. And obviously, it depends on what you want with the recipe or if there's a specific need, but generally you can replace the food item that the recipe calls for with a healthier option, right? So we're just going to look at the butter and the chicken broth, just because out of all the ingredients here, those are the two that tend to be the highest in sodium. So we're just going to look at those. So for example, when you're using butter in recipes, you can have salted or unsalted. And like I mentioned, sometimes, if you like a recipe better a certain way, I understand. But if possible, it's good to use the unsalted version, right? So as you can see here, 1 serving would be 1 tablespoon of butter. So in 1 tablespoon of butter, it would be 90 milligrams of sodium. And in the salted butter, in the unsalted butter, there's 0 milligrams of sodium, which I know that 90 milligrams doesn't seem like a ton because it's only 4%. But if you're trying to be really careful about, your sodium intake, or if you had a meal earlier in the day that was really high in sodium, that can make a difference, right? Okay. And then the chicken broth is really, to me, I feel like it makes a big difference if you get the reduced sodium option. So for the regular chicken broth that you can see here, there's 860 milligrams or 36% in 1 serving, which is 1 cup. So there's about 2 cups in this can, right? And then for the regular chicken broth. And then in the 35% less sodium, in one cup, there's only 25%. And this recipe actually called for 4 cans of the broth. So as you can see, that would make a really big difference, right? Using the reduced sodium compared to the regular. And I mean, maybe it depends on the person. This is just kind of a personal side note, but I actually started switching to, reduced sodium for all of our canned stuff. And it was funny because I mentioned something to my husband about how it was a healthier option. And he kind of was like, well, I don't know. I don't think I would want to do that because I don't think it would taste as good. And I told him that I had already been doing that for about a month before, and he didn't even notice. So, I mean, I guess it depends on the person, but to us, it didn't make a big difference taste wise, but it definitely made a big difference in our health, right? And the nutrients that we were getting. Okay. So in conclusion, food labels are really good tools that can really help us to make healthy choices for ourselves. And then, like I mentioned before, I really wanted to make sure that this is an important take home for you guys. The amount of each nutrient that our bodies need should be used as a guideline, not a specific amount that you have to reach daily or really concentrate on. It's really just a benchmark to kind of see how you're doing and kind of make adjustments when you're buying groceries. And then lastly, health claims can actually really be helpful in comparing different food products to choose the healthier option available.